Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Christina Heatherton. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Hashem Abushama. Hashem is an associate professor in human geography at Oxford University. He is a EUME Fellow at the Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin and a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Hashem is a human geographer. His work examines issues of urbanization, arts and capital, and geographies of dispossession within colonial and settler colonial contexts. He is currently working on several projects, including the book Cities and the Settler Colony, Accumulation, Dispossession, and Arts. Hashem is also the winner of the 2024 Stuart Hall Prize for his beautiful essay, A Map Without Guarantees, Stuart Hall and Palestinian Geographies. I'm very excited to be speaking with him here in Detroit. So Hashem, welcome to Conjuncture.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you. Throughout your work, Hashem, you think very deeply about the question of conjunctural analysis and the current conjuncture. And I've been very interested in your conceptualization of what you've described as the post-Oslo conjuncture in and through Palestine. So to begin, I wonder if you just might reflect with us on how you understand our current conjuncture.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, it might be helpful to start with just explaining what I mean by the conjuncture, which is a concept that we use in the spirit of Gramscian analysis to think about how different economic, cultural, capital, and social relations are linked together in a particular moment and define the social formation and the limits of possibilities for people within a particular space. And it also pays a lot of attention to the uneven relations between different social groups in a particular historical moment, and also the difference or the inequality between these different relations in a way whereby, for example, in the context of Palestine, the colonial relations become the articulating principle, the kind of determining principle for the social formation. So I find it incredibly generative in thinking about the so-called post-Oslo moment in Palestine. And I mean by that, a particular historical moment, which started in 1985, roughly, with, as a response to the first Palestinian Intifada, Intifada al-Ula, in which Palestinians ushered in incredible modes of resistance against Israeli settler colonialism, including civil disobedience, organized committees within the cities and the village, and so on. And that created a threat to the Israeli settler colonial state at the time. So there was that. There was also patterns of migration that restructured the relationship between labor and colonialism in Palestine. In the mid of the 1980s, you had around 1 million Russian Jews who came to Israel as settlers following the dismantling of the Soviet Union. You also had around 300,000 Asian migrant workers who came to Palestine as settlers. And that really shifted the relationship between Palestinian labor and Israeli settler colonialism, enhancing the modes of dependency of that labor on the Israeli settler colony. So coupled with that, you also had judicially, at the judicial level in 1985, the passing of the Economic Stabilization Plan, the ESP, the new liberalization of the Israeli economy, the privatization of previously of properties and institutions previously held as public institutions and properties in Israel, and also the free trade agreements that further integrated Israeli economy into wider circuits of neoliberal capitalist accumulation. So these are kind of the defining contradictions that come together in this particular conjuncture, and then would result in the Oslo Peace Accords, which were signed in 1993 and have been quite detrimental to the Palestinian liberation struggle, precisely because of their intensification of class stratification within Palestinian society, the reduction of the Palestinian liberation struggle to a neoliberal state framework that benefits only the ruling elites, the ruling elites in Palestine. And maybe we're going to talk about this maybe later on in the interview, but I do read the current moment, post-October 7th, as precisely the implosion of that, liberal peace-building framework, because, Hamas as a political party and a political movement that emerged in Palestine towards the end of the 1980s precisely emerged as a response to the limitations of the Oslo framework. And then once they decided to join that political framework in 2006, through the Palestine Legislative Council elections, they were surrounded and isolated by the European Union, the US, and that created a rift within Palestinian geographies between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank became controlled by the secular centrist nationalist party that's Fatah, and Gaza became controlled by Hamas. And so we can see really that, this post-October 7th moment as the implosion of that framework, because it could not contain the anti-colonial energies that continue to reverberate across Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. That was an extraordinary answer. I appreciate that very much. I will ask you a little bit about the present moment in a bit, but I want to ask you a little bit about your specific approach to thinking about Palestinian geography, because I've been so moved in your research and thinking about the way that you use a socio-spatial approach and the way that you think about multiple Palestinian geographies. And within those spaces, I find it very rich how you are attentive to forms of differentiation along lines of gender, race, class, even the identities of settlers within each space and how they shift and interact. So I wonder if we can talk a little bit about your socio-spatial approach and maybe some of the thinkers that you draw on to develop it.
Yes. So I think this comes from a place of taking very seriously the project of From the River to the Sea, Palestine Will Be Free. And if we are serious about that project, then we should also be serious about the differences that animate that project, because we are contending with a 100-year-old system of colonial fragmentation, segregation, and dispossession that have established mechanisms of apartheid and segregation across the map of historic Palestine, geographically, but also beyond, in terms of attacking the Palestinian diaspora in the refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and elsewhere. And so that kind of patterning of relations of segregation is felt in the everyday life of Palestinians living in different geographies in different ways. We are facing the same settler colonial entity, that's the Israeli state, but the ways in which that state and its settlers show up in our everyday life are actually differentiated by our spatiotemporal location vis-a-vis that Israeli state. So concretely, that means, the Palestinians who live within the Israeli state as citizens face a different set of conundrums and challenges and contradictions than the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who face the Israeli settlers, who face the checkpoints, and who face more and more theft of land. And the same can also be said about Palestinians in Gaza, who have been facing the most violent, grotesque forms of political violence by this settler colony. So I'm really troubled by the ways in which that settler colony shows up in our everyday life, the differences between its mechanisms of operation across these different geographies, not only to understand it as a system of oppression, importantly, and that's the importance of the conjuncture, or the conjunctural analysis, but also to understand the cracks, the fissures, the contradictions that underpin it in order to transform it, to take very seriously the project of a free Palestine.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've been moved across your work at the ways that I feel you are in dialogue with a number of thinkers, but particularly with Gramsci and with Fenon, in order to name both those dynamics in different spaces and also the resistance. So I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how you're drawing from Fenon and Gramsci to make sense of these dynamics.
Yeah, so with Gramsci, so I came to the writings of Gramsci through Stuart Hall. By working on arts, Stuart Hall was kind of natural reference for that. So I read a lot of his works, if not all of his works. And then, through Stuart Hall, I came to the writings of Gramsci and then Fenon. And I think they both share, as Ayaz Malik and Stefan Kipfer argue in a very important piece in Historical Materialism, that, both thinkers have sensitivity to the ways in which the subjective everyday relations are articulated to wider political economic relations, and in navigating that relationship in a non-reductive, non-sectarian way. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that kind of analysis in the context of Palestine. And so going back to the conjunctural shifts of post-1985 across the land of historic Palestine, then that concretely means tracing the shifts, the political economic shifts, whilst paying attention to the ways through which they are mediated across the different levels of the social formation. Concretely, that means trying to understand how they show up in the sphere of arts and culture. How does that relationship show up to a Palestinian artist working within a theater studio in Haifa, or a Palestinian artist in a music band in Ramallah, and trying to kind of trace the differences between these places. And I think both Gramsci and Fenon really helped me in thinking about these differences. And in terms of Fenon, I think thinking with him about the different class relations within Palestinian society, also about how violence structures the everyday reality in Palestine, both the settler colonial violence, but also the anti-colonial violence in Palestine. I've been increasingly going back to his writings to make sense of the current moment, and to think about these class relations and the different modes of resistance against capitalism and colonialism in Palestine.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is really helpful. I want to ask you a little bit about some new analytics that you introduce in order to make sense of this moment. In essay, Culture and the City, Articulations of Settler Colonialism from Haifa to Ramallah and Back, you introduced the concept of transformed settler colonialism. You identify this as a historically differentiated structure that transforms in different spatio-historical conjunctures. And as I understand it, it helps you account for the constitutive relation between colonial and global capitalist modes of accumulation. So I just want to invite you to help us understand transformed settler colonialism and explain why this is a meaningful category for your work.
So this comes from Stuart Hall's essay on the relevance of Gramsci to the study of race, in which he talks about the importance of talking about racisms rather than racism, so in the plural. And also he talks about transformed racisms, which is a concept that he uses to trace the shifts that happen in a particular racist system. And I think that's incredibly important to bring into discussions about how we understand settler colonialism, precisely because there has been a tendency to take up the writings of Patrick Wolf, for example, his formulation that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, and that the settlers come here to stay, and that because they come here to stay, they're after the land rather than the labor of the indigenous native communities. And I'm troubled by the ways in which that formulation is used unproblematically, and it kind of stabilizes these categories of land, labor, colonialism, capitalism, in a way that doesn't pay attention to contingency, to differentiation. And I'm troubled by that because we need to do that, to understand it as a contingent differentiated formation that, relies on certain historical relations that are created, that are produced to sustain itself, and that also there are modes of resistance and struggles of resistance against that formation. So that concretely means, refusing to accept that settler colonialism is eventual, or that it is a permanent structure, or that it is to understand it teleologically as a process that's just awaiting to be completed in Palestine through erasure and elimination, but to understand it as a contingent formation that's changing in every specific moment in relation to the wider processes of imperialist capitalist accumulation. Which is also important not only to account for Palestinian resistance, which is a long tradition of resistance against both British colonialism and Israeli settler colonialism that dates back at least to 1917. We can think about the 1936 revolution in Palestine. We can think about the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the 2021 uprising. So to think about these moments and take them really seriously as moments that bring the foundation of Israeli settler colonialism into question. And that's precisely the stuckness of that project, as Palestinian scholar Nasser Abrahman puts it, the stuckness of that project in the current moment is what we can use to understand its genocidal form, the genocidal form that it takes. And so I think, in terms of the transformed settler colonialism, it's about paying attention to these things, but also importantly, to de-exceptionalize Palestine, to think about it as a particular node of articulation for global imperialist processes of capitalist accumulation, but also importantly as an important node in the struggle against that imperialist process. And I think, the current moment has taught a lot of us that Palestine is the barricade. It's the barricade against fascism in Germany, with the police repression of the Palestine movement that has been incredibly shocking. And also in the UK, it has been the barricade against the rise of the right-wing forces, and in the US. And I don't think it's a surprise that Palestine is becoming kind of the condensed point for the far right and the fascist movements to attempt to purge out all of the emancipatory and liberatory possibilities across all different institutions of society, but also it has become the condensed point for many different struggles against racism, against transphobia, against the neoliberalization of the university, and against colonialism in different places.
That's a beautiful point. I think it segues really nicely to something that I want to ask you about that you've written. So thinking about, I think as you've helped us understand Palestine as an impasse, as a bottleneck, as a barricade. In a recent, in a forthcoming piece called Palestine and Anti-Colonial Marxism, and I'm going to quote you here. By the time we speak of Palestine, we end up with very little to offer. We end up with binaries, repeated mantras, perhaps condemnations, a series of qualifications, a cabinet of risk assessment files, maybe a playlist to soothe the anxieties of those whose oblivion towards the world is threatened by Palestine, unquote. I wonder if you could help us understand the circumscribed space for discussing Palestine at this moment. We obviously, as you mentioned, speak in a period of dramatic political repercussions, but I'm curious to hear you reflect on some of our conceptual limitations.
Thank you. I think this is, the quote that you read is really a frustration that I have from my own position as a teacher in a Western institution, liberal institution. And I have been, like many other scholars who are committed to thinking seriously about the current moment and the oppression, the systems of oppression and exploitation that communities around the world face, that, the spaces for us to have a conversation about these things, so the very basic liberal demand to even have a conversation about these issues is suffocated. It's not even possible. And I think this is particularly true in the case of Palestine. And we have to remember here again, from a conjunctural view, the layers, the condensations that come together to enable that kind of dehumanization of Palestine and Palestinians and suffocation of spaces to speak about Palestine. And I think, in the context of the UK, for example, we cannot think about that without thinking about Prevent, which rose, after the so-called war on terror, and has been used against Muslim, brown and black communities within the UK to racialize and profile them through the insidious use of the racist language of quote-unquote terrorism. And so that is precisely the framework that has been used since October 7th against students, against colleagues, against organizers and protesters within the UK. And the same can also be said, I think, about the US, right? So this kind of racist discourse that predates October 7th is weaponized against Palestine and the Palestinians. So we have this first force that we need to understand and reckon with. Then the second thing is obviously the neoliberalization of the university, which has contributed to the suffocation of critical spaces and has insisted on flattening all of the disciplines to kind of turn them into caterers to the job market, to suffocate any kind of serious intellectual reckoning with the current moment and history also. So we also have that moment, and so all of these and we also have the attack on a very caricatured version of critical race theory from the far right, an attack on trans communities and trans people, so all of these different attacks on the university, we have been feeling them in trying to speak about Palestine. Hence the reference to the risk assessment files, because in order for you to even to get to the point to sit on the table to talk about Palestine, you will have signed so many forms, you will have been so fatigued and tired to even have that conversation, right? And then you have the limitations of the racist discourse that puts you in the space of, do you condemn, and do you justify? Do you condemn? Do you justify? And I find that to be obviously an incredibly racist question, but it's also a product of what Fenon would refer to as the Manichaeism of the colonial situation, in which there is a reification of a binary between the colonizer and the colonized, and kind of absolute antagonism between them. And the result of that is a dehumanization of the colonized. And once the colonized takes up arms and uses violence to stand up for themselves, then it's just seen as ahistorical, apolitical, beastly in nature, animalistic, without kind of any sort of reasoning behind it. And I think we really, learning from Fenon, we really need to move beyond that Manichaeism to take very seriously violence as a social phenomenon that's produced because of colonialism in Palestine, to understand it also as a contingent social phenomenon that's historically produced, that's politically produced, and to try to reckon with that and understand that, how it's mediated through different levels of Palestinian society, how it's connected to the formation of different parties within Palestine, what are the different social groups that exist in Palestine, and how do they relate to that kind of mode of anti-colonial violence. And these are the questions that we haven't been able to think of violence as a social phenomenon, as a degenerative form of social existence, as Atusa Kyoto in his reading of Fenon would put it, to understand it as a degenerative form of social existence or a contingent social phenomenon, in order precisely to think of a more emancipated future in which that violence does not make sense. So then, not to place on the shoulders of the Palestinians the responsibility to respond to all of the violence that organizes our societies, singling out the Palestinians as and our use of anti-colonial violence as some sort of irrational, ahistorical, animalistic tendency, rather than as something that's dialectically produced through the realities that we live under, of constantly facing the soldiers at the checkpoints, the soldiers who go through your homes to dispossess you from your home and destroy your home, the soldiers who attack you from warplanes and F-16s, that kind of everyday violence that structures our everyday reality, Fenon would say, is the driving force behind the forms of anti-colonial violence.
Absolutely, absolutely. I appreciate all your work so much for how it speaks into this impasse, these conceptual limitations, and also gives us, I think, a different sense of possibility and contingency. And in that respect, I want to ask you a little bit about a recent essay. You recently received the Stuart Hall Prize for your essay, A Map Without Guarantees, Stuart Hall and Palestinian Geographies. I wonder if you could help us understand both your relationship to Hall, but I'd very much like you to explain the concept of a map without guarantees.
Thanks for that question. Yes, so that essay was kind of my way of trying to make sense of what's going on in Palestine after October 7th, but also after spending a lot of time reading a lot of what Stuart Hall wrote. And maybe there's here a bit of a personal confluence with Stuart Hall as someone who came from a formerly colonized place to study at Oxford and was trying to make sense of all of these different formations that were showing up in his life. And I think his book, his autobiography, Familiar Stranger in particular, was incredibly inspiring for me. And I think it is an incredible piece of writing of trying to basically do a conjunctural analysis of one's own life, to trace, using the Gramscian register to kind of think about the infinity of traces that different historical and geographical processes leave in our everyday lives without leaving an inventory. And I read The Familiar Strangers, precisely that attempt by Stuart Hall to think or to weave together an inventory of the infinity of traces that showed up in his life. And I loved the ways in which he would walk us through a personal anecdote, and then all of a sudden it's being used as an entry point into thinking about the multiple determinations that come together, be it in Jamaica or in the UK to define the limits of possibilities for his own life. And so A Map Without Guarantees is an attempt to do something similar. And it was also inspired by Hazel Carby's incredible book, Imperial Intimacies, in which she beautifully and creatively uses a very similar approach of walking you through a personal journey that's not personal but also collective, because it's so insistent on understanding these systems of oppression and the modes of resistance against it. And so the essay kind of walks, through my encounter of going back to where I grew up in the north of Hebron, in southern West Bank, and encountering an Israeli settler highway that cut through the fabric of, our place of livelihood, and the violence that inflicts on that space, and then working through the history of that by connecting back to my family's village prior to 1948, and again thinking about that particular spatiotemporal conjuncture, the differences between these two spaces, and what does that do to our analysis of settler colonialism. So there was that aspect of the essay. And then the other aspect, the Map Without Guarantees, is trying to think about how, under Israeli settler colonialism, Israel does not have defined borders. And so Israel does not have, as a map, guarantees about its borders. So why do we need to have guarantees as well? And so thinking about, using that play of words, building on Stuart Hall's very important essay, Marxism Without Guarantees, which was his attempt to kind of make sense or find a way between economistic readings of Marx that assume a necessary correspondence between the economic relations and the superstructures, the ideology, the law, the culture, and so on, and the post-structuralist tendency to then respond to that limitation by assuming a necessary non-correspondence, to say that things are just not corresponding structurally to one another. And so he was trying to say that there is a way of trying to understand the ways in which systems are contingent, are produced in a particular moment, and we need to pay attention to the specificity of that there are no guarantees that settler colonialism will unfold as a structure that is going to prioritize the land over labor across time and space, that we need to understand that through the specificity of each historical moment. And so using that and the map metaphor to think about settler colonialism as the map of settler colonialism in Palestine as having no guarantees over its borders. And I think we're precisely seeing that in the current moment, the attempts by the Israeli settler colonial project to expand into other Palestinian territories, but also other Arab territories in the Golan Heights in southern Lebanon and elsewhere, but also to think about the without guarantees and its implications for the Palestinian resistance tradition of, again, going back to From the River to the Sea project, and what does that mean to our working towards that moment of liberation.
Beautiful. I really love how you also engaged Doreen Massey in this essay to make just the simple but profound point that space is not dead, right? Mm-hmm. And I hear you theorizing that without guarantees coming a lot from how you're thinking about space. On that note, I want to just mention our pins. We've been together in Detroit for the American Association of Geographers annual conference. Stefan Kipfer and Jordan Camp and Jillian Hart organized a track of panels around new directions in Gramsci. The pins are for about Geographers for Justice in Palestine. Mm-hmm. And your presentation there spoke about tactics and strategies for Palestinian solidarity. In your presentation on Geographies of Cultural Boycott, you discuss how conceptions of space and power influence forms of resistance. And you posed a really interesting question, which was, what does it mean to be in a grocery shop and choose to buy the avocado from South Africa instead of the avocado from Israel? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could help us understand this question and its provocation for solidarity movements today.
Yes, that question is rhetorical, but it's trying to work through the certain problem of how to make sense of the relationship between settler colonialism and capitalism in Palestine and its differentiation across space and time within Palestine, but also how to link that to a wider questioning of the capitalist social relations that organize our everyday life at a more global level. And so to think about the limitations of that option of the two avocados being both produced through differentiated iterations of neoliberal settler colonialism, one in South Africa, which kind of preys on entrenched systems of economic segregation from the apartheid era South Africa, and another avocado that's coming from Israeli settler colonialism and its entrenched forms of segregation, apartheid, genocide, and siege in Palestine. And really to pose the question around the capitalist circuits of commodities as an important site for us to question and bring into question and resist. And so that's kind of the point of that question, was to pose that problematic in these terms. And it was my entry point into thinking with the boycotts, divestment and sanctions movement in Palestine as a serious iteration, a serious movement that's trying to take that difference between Palestinian geographies very seriously. So because I've been troubled with that question of space and its relationship to settler colonialism and how it's differentiated across space and time, I've been learning a lot from the movement's dynamic attempt to make sense of how to think about its criteria for boycotts and to apply them in the Palestinian territories that Israel had occupied in 1948, which some call Israel proper, and then the territories that Israel had occupied in 1967, which include the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and of course the Syrian Golan Heights. And I think in their attempt to make sense of that, they offer us a very concrete program of thinking about Palestinian space in a way that takes difference seriously. And this is something that I've been reflecting on and trying to make sense of. How do you take very seriously our unity as a nation, as a movement in Palestine, but precisely by working through the very real differences that Israeli settler colonialism has imposed on us because of the segregation that has spanned around 100 years, right? The different modes of governance, of control, of management, of erasure that Palestinians face as second or third class citizens within the bounds of Israeli citizenship apparatus and so-called Israel proper, right? Presents a very different set of conundrums and contradictions than facing it as mediated through the Palestinian Authority and the ruling elites in Palestine as a neoliberal project that promised some sort of it's really an impossible promise of some sort of a free market ideology that can work precisely through colonialist expansion and colonialist thefts and through the genocidal campaigns that have been happening against Gaza. And so all of these different kind of forms of violence against the Palestinians, because they are articulated across the different levels of society, because we face them differently, they present a different set of contradictions that we need to take seriously in thinking about a unified Palestine and a movement for a free Palestine.
We've been talking a lot about the difficulties of this work and the difficulties of having these conversations. And you and I have talked about the kind of spaces that we've had to create to engage with others, to do this type of work. So I feel compelled to ask you, especially because we're gathered together in this kind of conjuncture family in relationship to the AAG, this work on Gramsci, the Stuart Hall Foundation, the Antipode Foundation. I want to ask you about political friendships. And I want to ask you about how we create spaces amongst ourselves to do this work while the institutional spaces are effectively disappearing.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you for that. The first thing that comes to mind is the students who have really insisted on creating that space for Palestine, and at the moment where that space was being institutionally and systematically suffocated, it was the students who fought for that space to be respected and to be enabled. And that has also been my experience in my own institution, of the students advocating for that space to be created to teach Palestine, to think about Palestine critically, and to have these conversations on Palestine. And I think that experience is true of many different campuses. And then the second thing is on the notion of solidarity as a critical political friendship. And in my own kind of trajectory, I've had an encounter with, the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland. I lived there as a student, but I continue to go back there. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as soon as the genocide started, I went to Derry, precisely because of that beautiful critical embrace that city has of Palestine and the Palestinians, in the sense that, you have murals supporting Palestine around the entire fabric of the city, and that's not an overstatement. That Palestine continues to be a present conversation in the pubs and the restaurants amongst the different families, and I think that's precisely the project of solidarity that we are trying to build. To think about these political friendships that span decades, if not centuries, which enable these moments that are felt in the everyday level as a critical political friendship, as an embrace of one another. And I had that same encounter, I visited for the first time Cape Town last December with colleagues and friends, and I also felt that critical embrace in a place that also knows, colonial violence and racist violence, but also knows anti-colonial violence and knows the pain and the grief that comes with that. And I think both Northern Ireland and South Africa share that kind of grief and pain with Palestine. And there's a lot for us to learn from the earlier generations of strong, powerful, anti-imperialist, internationalist left across these different spaces that wanted to precisely nurture these political friendships and amplify them and enhance them in a way that makes that everyday critical embrace felt across more and more spaces and more spaces and times. So that's how I think of the political friendships, and I think, again, to put it within a global conjunctural framework, as Jill Hart put it in her very important intervention at the AAG. These moments of solidarity, she said something along the lines of, it's not only that Palestine has a lot to learn from South Africa, it's also that South Africa and the South African left has a lot to learn from Palestine, precisely because it has become this condensed site for the articulation of what it means to live freely in this world, right? It has been the site that brings together, it's the condensed side of attack against all of us, against Black communities, against Franc communities, against trans communities, against the university. And precisely because of its condensation as a site, this convergence, that it has become also the barricade that we need to learn from in amplifying a more emancipatory project for all of us. So the global conjunctural framework then is not only about understanding these systems of oppression, but also understanding the ways in which we have always resisted these systems of oppression, and to amplify and enhance the already existing practices and bases of solidarity. So to go back to Derry, for example, that's not a coincidence that the city's fabric has this beautiful expression of Palestine that is so relentless in its articulation, because it's the afterlife of a particular moment in the 1980s in which Palestinian prisoners from Nafha prison were sending and smuggling letters out to the Irish hunger strikers, including Bobby Sands, right? And so that's the afterlife of that solidarity that we can enhance and amplify and elaborate on through this important conjunctural analysis, I think.
Thank you. I want to go back actually to where you started your answer to talk about students, because at this moment, students that are demonstrating Palestinian solidarity are being specifically targeted and kidnapped by the state. Mm-hmm. I would be curious to think with you about the role of students and whether you had any message for them.
There was a discourse at the beginning of this round of genocide in Palestine, which said, something along the lines of the students have less to use than the staff members at the university. And I think what's happening now is precisely showing that they actually don't, and they have a lot to lose, and they're sacrificing a lot for standing up for Palestine, including being kidnapped by fascist state forces on the streets. Yeah, the students have offered a lot for us to learn about how to hold that barricade, to insist on having, as a minimum demand, a conversation on Palestine, a critical conversation on Palestine and what's going on in Palestine within the institutions. But beyond that, to think about building serious infrastructures for combating the rising trends of far right and fascism, which are becoming increasingly more and more threatening to the institutions and the communities that surround us. And so I think the students offer us an entry point for a serious praxis that is insisting on holding the barricade for Palestine. And I have been learning a lot from that as a teacher within these institutions, to insist on holding that space. And I think that's a message for all of us, to really insist on holding that space in the current moment, instead of conceding more and more ground to the rising far right groups everywhere.
Absolutely. There's a lot more I can ask you about, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Is there anything that you would like to discuss that I haven't yet asked?
No, I think this has been great, and I just want to stress the importance of doing this kind of conjunctural analysis within Palestine and beyond, and to thank you, you and Jordan Camp, for the important work that you're putting into this conjuncture and podcast, and highlighting the importance of that approach to understanding how these systems of domination work, but also the movements of resistance against them. I think this task is becoming increasingly really pressing and urgent.
Absolutely. Well, we're incredibly grateful for your work. So thank you so much, Hashem Abushama, for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks so much to all our listeners and viewers. Stay tuned.